So let's talk through some basic Warhammer 40k gameplay tips with some rules of thumb to help newer players level up their tabletop game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be fun to talk through a cluster of different 40k gameplay advice, touching on a bunch of different topics, and maybe this one focusing a little bit more on the basics, some simple tricks and tactics. This will generally be pretty common knowledge to people super experienced with the game, but might not be the most obvious to people who are newer to putting their models on the tabletop. Let's go through a bunch of things one by one, talk about why they're important to understand, and a few simple things to think about when in game. First up, there's understanding the importance of sacrificial units in game. Warhammer 40k often tends to be about trading units in one way or another. The idea that your opponent's forced to expose and lose bigger and more important units than yours, and perhaps the simplest sort of way to enforce that sort of thing to happen is to have a bunch of lower points cost units in the army that still absolutely need to be dealt with, maybe to have them fighting on the front lines in game. So ideally, if your opponent does move towards them and destroy them, then hopefully you'll be in a position to hit whatever killed them back extra hard. The sort of units might be things like Chaos Nurglings, Space Marine Scouts, World Eaters Spawn or Jackals, Chaos Cultists, and various units of cheap scouts. Ideally something that's got a lot lower points cost invested within the unit versus most of the other things in the army. They can be on the front lines and maybe stop enemy units moving up or screen out deep strikes, hopefully get onto the mid-board objectives and score primary or secondary objectives in the midfield, perhaps nestling into the corners of ruins and things so they're hard to dislodge, and potentially engaging and destroying certain enemy outlying units if they've got other ones that are going to be equally expendable. The idea is that if you have cheap units like this, it might be barely worth the opponents to expose their important stuff to destroy them. I guess perhaps the absolute goal would be, say you had some Space Marine Scouts hiding out of line of sight on a mid-board objective, your opponent then goes on to charge them with a big scary melee threat, or moves a shooting unit to gain line of sight on them and has to expose it to your other stuff in return. Then hopefully you'll be all ready to jump on that high points investment unit, maybe countercharge the melee threat, or turn all your big guns onto the enemy range threat, and then move your stuff from a place of safety behind terrain in the backfield, and get the first strike that actually matters. Hopefully it could wind up with your sacrificial unit being dead, but also really quite an important enemy unit dead, so you come out ahead in the trading game. This one maybe feels like the simplest example that you could possibly do of that kind of thing, and in reality you might have to wind up weighing up which units to expend and which units not to, as you're advancing up the board, scoring objectives and getting damage in. But I guess it partly just amounts to also thinking a turn ahead. How is your opponent going to hit you back? And when they have, what position will you be in to press the attack yourself? Next up, I feel like for the vast majority of armies in the game, having at least one unit in strategic reserve or in deep strike is generally going to be a positive, whether you're building it in as deep strikers that intend to do that in your army, or you're putting a damage dealer style unit in strategic reserve. Reserves are maybe one of the things that have diminishing returns. Some armies can go super heavy on them if you want, but I definitely feel like the single first unit that you put in reserve tends to have higher value than anything else, as it just gives you a bunch of options. It might force your opponents to screen out the board if otherwise they might not bother, so having to chain out units and maybe think about holding things back to stop your things coming into their deployment zone. Obviously it allows your units to get the first strike against any enemy units, and particularly if it's a shooting threat, and it allows for good options when scoring secondary objectives. Having cheap deep strikers on hand can be good for that. Return to reserves units can also be particularly great for most of that as well, as it means that you could have the advantages of reserves into later turns. On top of all that, if you've got a reserve damage dealer, it could give you the option to use rapid ingress, which for one command point I think could be one of the more valuable stratagems in the game. The idea being to drop some scary melee units somewhere that's going to be completely safe, maybe behind a line of sight blocking ruin, but then also somewhere that after you've moved and charged, you've got a near guaranteed charge into melee, and that's often going to be worth really quite a lot, as often melee units tend to be balanced around the fact that it's somewhat difficult to get them into close combat. The exact threats that you might want in reserve could vary a lot from army to army. Could be cheap deep strikers to do secondaries and things, or maybe could be something like a War Dog or a Knight Armiger going into strategic reserve for Knights or Chaos Knights, or a big central melee threat like a bunch of Death Shroud Terminators with Typhus in Death Guard. In general though, I feel like the majority of factions could usually profit from at least having some. Next up, another basic one is using casualty removal for advantage. When the opponent whistles down your squads, you do actually still have some decisions to make. Some of the units might be in cover and some of them might not be. So it might depend on where you take saves, whether you're taking saves on models that get the cover save, or you're choosing to take the saves on things that are closest to the enemy unit. So let's say you might be increasing your charge distance, or you might be trying to preserve every model that you can on an objective, so there's at least some chance to hold that point into the next turn. For the damage and defense type of thing, aside from cover saves though, having the front rank die to enemy fire and then giving the opponent a better chance to fail a key charge could be really big. That could often matter a lot more compared with shooting damage, or it might at least mean that they need to command point reroll it or something. If your opponent's also got multiple big shooting units on the go, you might be able to remove models in such a way that it breaks line of sight to the next unit that would want to shoot at them. That's particularly often the case if, say, you've only got line of sight to one of the outlying models, and the order that units choose to shoot a unit could be incredibly important. In melee, there could be some interesting options as well. If you're in a big ongoing combat with units that haven't charged, you might actually be able to pull models so that the enemy unit isn't actually engaged when it gets to their turn to fight. If they've charged, they'd need to be really quite a long way away from your models, as they'll still be able to pile in before they get to strike, but if they hadn't charged, you might just be able to remove them from combat and deny them a bunch of damage. It's a little bit situational, and often you might just need to do obvious things like taking saves on the things that have the cover saves, or preserving models that have the fancy war gear like sergeants and things, but sometimes taking the casualties in the right place can be really big. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Tech, one option for miniature transport systems with their Mechie Plus carry cases, which do things quite differently to the majority of the other systems out there. They've currently got a Kickstarter running that's in its final days at the moment for their carry cases with grippy components. The idea with the Mechie cases, they have a component system where you have a bunch of things that can grab onto models' bases, basically having a custom part for each size base, and then you have different varieties of simple clips to hold them in place as they're transported about. Here's a few examples of the things being operated, and you can have your own custom set of modules within a carry case to be tailored to your force. The Kickstarter's aiming to expand on their basic set of Mechie slider cases. As you can see here, there's one set up with an AdMech army on the top right, and the Kickstarters for their Plus cases, with a coloured finish and acrylic piece to display the miniatures in transport, and a few other perks. You can see here's their Combat Patrol case, which can fit anyone for 40k. Here's a few of my miniatures hanging out in one of them. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description. I'll talk through a few more of their cases at the end of the video, but in any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Getting back to the 40k gameplay though, I feel like one fairly common newer player mistake is getting the balance wrong between dealing damage or winning on points. Maybe it's more common for people to just forget about point scoring and just go all out to destroy the opponent's army, even if that occasionally could hinder you compared with remaining more focused. I would say that given that's such a commonly parroted talking point, some people maybe overdo it to go the other way. It is definitely true in 40k though that when you get to the end of the game, it's not the person that's destroyed the most of the enemy army that wins, it's the person who's got the most primary and secondary points. Certainly one way that you can run ahead on that is to just destroy the enemy army and not have any contest as to scoring in the last couple of rounds. But I've certainly had games where one side is near enough wiped out, but by that time they've already managed to get so far ahead on points there's no chance of the other player catching up, where they've won the damage game massively but they've lost the points game equally spectacularly. Just in general, when building an army, you need a plan for scoring both primary points and secondary objectives. Generally that means having some units in your list that are going to be quite good for doing both of those, and often while they're going about their business, doing damage and skirmishing with the enemy as well. Ideally for things that are good for holding primaries, having at least one unit that's really tough in your army and parking that on a mid-board objective is generally going to cause at least some problems, or at least tough and annoying for the points cost that the opponent doesn't want to have to deal with it. Often in Warhammer games you might be able to hide one unit on a mid-board objective and then have to expose a unit to try and take the next one, so tough units could be handier with that. For secondary objectives, just for ease of it, the majority of newer players often tend to go tactical, which is often absolutely fine. If going for those though, I would be tempted to have at least some units in your army that are quite small, cheap and fast moving, maybe having some deep strikers as mentioned, to run around doing those actions and things while the important stuff gets on with the killing. I think another thing that people maybe don't appreciate quite so much as well is that the balance of importance changes as the game goes along. Typically damage and destroying enemy units is going to have the biggest impact on turn 1, as that unit won't be able to do anything else for the rest of the next 4 turns, where on the 5th turn, damage almost literally doesn't matter whatsoever unless it's directly denying points or scoring you points, as it doesn't really matter if anything survives into round 6, as round 6 doesn't exist. Basically it means that there's a bit of an incentive for armies to maybe play a little bit cagey and make sure they don't lose the damage game early on, but then go hell for leather towards the rest of the game to wrap up as many points as they possibly can. It does depend on the strategy though. If the strategy is just to basically charge and overwhelm and destroy the entire enemy army, then you're probably going to play aggressively either way. One thing I've certainly seen a couple of times before are people playing too cautious because they want to absolutely lose none of their units and make sure they can destroy the enemy army. I've had a couple of games where the opponents just lurked in their deployment zone and chipped away at all the units advancing, meaning that they could wind up tabling the other army, but by that point it doesn't matter because they've been all over the mid-board objectives all game. So in that case you probably had to be a little bit more aggressive. But on the other hand, I certainly have seen the flip side as well. People get so fixated on scoring and things that they just do things that just don't really make sense with their units, exposing big important stuff and allowing them to be destroyed really early in the game. And it just means they don't have enough stuff to wind up holding off the enemy army for the rest of it. They've expended too much too early, and maybe not appreciated the value that you could get by destroying enemy units and denying them the opportunity to score. Basically, though, it's a bit of a balance. You can be aiming to wipe out the enemy, but you need to have points in your mind as you go about doing it. While we're talking about objective scoring, maybe just one of the most practical things that you can do right from the very start of the game is having a plan for what's going on the mid-board objectives. The vast majority of armies out there are likely going to be wanting to try and contest those turn 1, so you can get the points rolling with scoring from turn 2 onwards, or at least make your opponent have to deal with those units that you pushed up. In your army, you should have plans for what's aiming to take those primaries. Infiltrators and scouts can both be really quite good for holding a primary on the mid-board, particularly if they can hide out of line of sight. But if you don't have those in the army and your main plan for holding them is for your regular on-the-board units to push up and take them, you need to absolutely make sure they can absolutely get there. And that's well worth pre-measuring, both with their movement characteristics and what sort of advanced roll you might need. And it's certainly a mistake that I've made a couple of times in the past, thinking a unit could get to a mid-board objective and then realising they couldn't without an advanced roll, or needing a higher one than I might have expected. And that could literally be the difference between winning or losing 5 victory points at the start of the game. It can vary a fair bit depending on deployment maps, but for a fair few of them you're often deploying 12 inches back from the mid-board, and for a 6-inch movement unit you'd usually need at least a 3 advance to get to the point, and that's if you've deployed absolutely as close as you possibly can. Talking about infiltrators briefly, again I feel like these guys are light reserves. If your army has an efficient unit that can be used as infiltrators, it's often well worth having one, just to give you quite big options with gameplay which might have a lot of value, far more so than what the unit's actually going to do in terms of damage or defense. Again, I feel like infiltration is something that you want to go kind of limited on. It's usually something that has diminishing returns as you use up the good spots to put the units, and if you put too much forward then you just run the risk of the enemy just dealing loads of damage to it anyway, and kind of counterintuitively making their job easy for them. Just having one single unit in an army can be really good though. As mentioned, put a unit on primary objectives nice and hidden from the start. That unit will then be in a position to do a bunch of secondary objectives right away if you need them. But perhaps for more big gameplay style things, it means that you can also block out enemy infiltrators and scouts for taking up certain positions in the mid-board, and that can potentially safeguard the rest of your army behind them. Say for example if you're playing against Leagues of Votann or World Eaters who can get some massive scout moves with threatening units, or Marnie's Calgar and Aggressors in Ultramarines Vanguard. If they were trying to infiltrate into the mid-board, at least you can guarantee that they're not going to be at that particular location, so you can put some stuff down in your deployment zone in a bit more safety. Depending on the army that you're playing as well, sometimes it could be really big for just jumping on a high value target early, or move blocking something critical. Say for example if they've got a big expensive monstrous creature or melee damage dealer, that you can just move your infiltration unit up the board so they can't move past you for a turn. Again, that could be kind of painful and get you a big advantage in the game as you don't have to deal with them for one more turn. When deploying them, if your opponent has infiltrators of your own, it might make sense to drop them down early, so that you get to choose the best spot before they've put down theirs, or otherwise as normal maybe wait until a fair bit of their army's gone down so you can choose the right spots to place them. Infiltrators can also be great with things like Scout or redeploys as well, giving you yet more control over where they are. Scout could allow them to go aggressive or pull back a bit. Redeploys could potentially allow you to deny enemy infiltrators to set up and then pull back your own ones into safety. I feel like in general if you've got an efficient infiltrator unit that's like 70 points or less, it's very hard not to take at least one copy of them. Maybe things that are a bit pricier, things like Orc Commandos or Sisters Novitiate, they might be a little bit more take or leave, as they're not really quite so cheap and expendable then. Next up, again really quite basic, but something that newer players to 40k don't tend to do as much as they probably should, is making sure they're absolutely hiding every unit that they can whenever they can. At least in 10th edition the game tends to be balanced around units being able to hide out of line of sight, and unless the unit's generally quite durable or if you've got loads of targets moving up, allowing the opponents to get the jump on any one squad or unit is generally a bad idea, so denying enemy shooting at every turn is good if it's at all possible. When playing more casually, part of this can be to do with just actually setting up the right table to start with. 10th 40k does tend to be balanced around fairly dense terrain, lots of line of sight blocking ruins. Here's one example of Games Workshop's terrain layouts here. 8 big ruins on the board and still a bunch of smaller things that also block lines of sight. You don't necessarily need to play on tournament layouts, though in general I think it's best having at least a good amount of line of sight blocking terrain on the table. Usually multiple pieces for each player to hide stuff in their own deployment zone and multiple pieces in the mid board. to at least make sure that some of the objectives have room to hide on, though often maybe one or two might be exposed. If you're playing without too much terrain, it's usually going to be a big advantage to shooting armies, or if you're playing against two shooting armies, probably the first one to get the jump on the other one, and whether or not their damage and defense is more efficient and just a bit of luck. In any case though, when you're on the board, you need to prioritise which units are going to get the best hiding spots and which might need to rough it out in the open. Generally fragile, fast things can often jump from terrain to terrain, and if anything's going to be exposed, it may as well be your most durable or most expendable units, having to brave it on the mid-board, or tanky dreadnoughts and things having to walk around terrain as they don't really have enough choice. When you're advancing up the board, your opponent is going to get lines of sight on some things, but it might be possible to deny shooting from really big scary units, or at least make sure that they can't go into their optimal targets. And maybe if the opponent's got some sort of big scary shooting unit, it might be worth checking where they can move, and whether or not they'll be able to gain line of sight on you, maybe even opting to adjust your movement a bit to hang back a touch if you're going to be able to deny them getting the alpha strike. Next up, you could certainly say a lot about command point management, but perhaps having one command point in reserve could be another good rule of thumb, obviously depending a bit on the exact army that you're playing and how much they desperately need the stratagems nice and early to get in the core things that they want to do. If it's possible though, at least keeping one command point in the bank to jump on targets of opportunity or ward off against bad luck can be handy. That's basically with command points in 40k, there'll be things that you've been planning to do that are core parts of how your units want to get the jump on the enemy. Things where you'll be able to get predictably more damage or more defense out of them, or opportunities where you might be able to cause swings in the game, such as stop the opponent killing a unit with every active move, or interrupting in melee to destroy an enemy unit that would have destroyed you. I feel like command point management is often about trying to maximise the amount of those good swings in a game that you get, and spend the resource as wisely as possible for that. And it means that if you're a bit too trigger happy with the command points, re-rolling hit rolls and things like that, it might deny you the opportunity to spend it on something that was going to be far more impactful. Maybe the classic one being if you fail a short charge, something that if you had a command point, you'd almost certainly be able to alter to succeed. And things like a failed charge in 40k can be the difference between massive amounts of damage and killing a unit perhaps, or nothing at all. Other targets of opportunity could be in the sort of damage and defense type things. Maybe say re-rolling a save if your opponent just attacks your unit with the last thing that they can possibly attack it with. Maybe safeguarding a character or keeping a squad alive or an objective to score the point next turn, or using a faction specific stratagem at the right time. Say maybe using a durability war in close combat so your squad lives rather than dies. Again though, it's definitely a balancing act. As with quite a lot of things, if you're winding up with something like 5 or 6 command points in the tank over the course of a game, then that's a pretty clear sign that you're just not spending them fast enough. You definitely want ones for targets of opportunity, but you also want to be spending them as a resource to influence the game early. The more swings that you get early in the game, the more powerful they tend to be. So again, it can be a bit of a balance between the two. Next up, another one that seems to be fairly easily forgotten amongst new players is remembering to bother consolidating after a fight, perhaps partly because the fight phase sequence isn't the single most intuitive thing in the world and takes a little bit of time to get your head around, but also because the main focus of the fight phase is often on dealing the damage and trying to destroy the enemy models, and then consolidation is something that often doesn't really matter all that much afterwards, but in some cases it can be really, really big. After you've dealt damage with the attacks, each model gets to consolidate up to 3 inches closest to the nearest enemy model, provided their unit can wind up in engagement range with at least one enemy, or failing that they can consolidate towards an objective. If a unit's still in melee with another enemy one, you could use it to move your models up and get into base-to-base contact with a bunch of their models, preventing them from moving, or you could pile your models forward a little bit to potentially get more bodies onto an objective if it makes sense, or potentially use the consolidate move to maybe help encircle an enemy unit. Say for example, if you could consolidate all around an enemy vehicle, then if it fell back it'd have to take desperate escape tests, which could also be pretty nasty. Otherwise though, if you've destroyed the enemy unit, you might be able to move into and tag the next enemy unit. If there's enemy models within 4 inches, then the 3-inch move should be able to get you within engagement range, and that could be really good if you've got the option to do that with sort of low damage shooting units, then giving them the annoying choice as to whether or not to remain in combat or fall back and be unable to shoot in most circumstances. It might be quite nice to try and set that up by the position that you end your charges in as well. If you can wind up with at least one model within 4 inches of an enemy unit, that could at least make that an option. Otherwise, if you're unable to consolidate into engagement range, you could use the movements to get onto an objective. You're allowed to do that provided the unit at least winds up in range of an objective, and that movement actually has quite a lot of freedom. You could use it to be able to get a bunch of Space Marines behind a ruined wall to stop them getting shot in return. The models have to wind up closer to the central objective. They don't necessarily have to go in a straight line, so you could sort of move them sort of like angling around the objective if it got them safer in cover. In general, there's quite a lot of advantages that could be kind of small, but could be sort of game-changing if it's the difference between, say, your unit hiding or not, or the enemy not being able to shoot with another squad, so definitely worth seeing if there's any possibilities for that. In any case though, hope you've enjoyed a few ideas for some basic advice to get a little bit better at 40k, and let me know any other things that you've learned recently that have really helped your tabletop experience. I'd definitely be interested to hear any other small things that you've learned that you previously didn't used to do, and it's helped you out in game. That's the end of the video, but I'll just cycle back quickly to Tabletop Tech, the video sponsor, and talk a little bit more about their Clippy model carry cases. All 40k transport systems have their own pros and cons. I feel like perhaps the greatest strength for these ones are armies that remain at least reasonably stable and maybe slightly smaller collections as opposed to big 2,000 point armies. Perhaps combat patrol, kill team and spearheads or incursion size armies might be the best strength of it, but they definitely do have bigger offerings that can fit 2,000 point armies if desired. For the advantages of them, they look pretty nice and feel nice, really quite satisfying to use those little components and machines to get the models in and out. And the idea is that you can have quite a lot of miniatures in a small space due to holding them side by side and not needing any foam or anything to insulate them, plus not needing to mount magnets on the bases versus that solution. For downside, I'd say the main one is that it's a bit less speedy to get things in and out compared with certain options, just due to operating each little simple component as you do so. I've seen a few people describe it as a little bit over-engineered, though I'm not sure that's the worst thing in the world. The other downside is that it might not be super flexible once set up. You certainly can swap out the modules without too much effort, and some of the cases can do so really quite easily compared with others. But you still need to have the right modules for the right miniatures bases, and that might need to get more of them or something. So that's why I think it's a little bit better for more consistent armies that you might be playing with the same miniatures week on week. There are plenty of other good transport options out there, of course. In any case though, for their offerings, they've got the Combat Patrol case that can fit any regular 40k Combat Patrol. This one's £72, 87 euros or $91 from their Kickstarter right now. The dimensions are on the screen. The biggest one they have is their 24 module one, where as you can see you can fit an entire Crimson Fist army in there pretty comfortably, lots of big tanks, dreadnoughts and drop pods. Plus they've got options for monster style ones as well. Big fragile wing things can often be one of the trickier things to transport in 40k. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to check out their carry cases. In any case, I'll leave this one there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I tend to have new things out just about every day. Feel free to check out the things down in the video description, such as the Patreon page if you'd like to support the channel, or the affiliate discount links for cheaper Warhammer. A big thank you to anyone using those, but otherwise just an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.